This happened during the week my family was assembling old photo albums for my grandmother's memorial gathering. Everyone else was worried about getting the arrangements right. But what scared me was inside my own house. My name is Austin Crawford. At the time, I was living in a single-story rental house in a quiet suburb outside of Madison, Wisconsin. It was early November, and my grandmother had recently passed away. My family decided to create a massive visual display for her memorial service. Since I worked from home and had a large dining room table, I volunteered to take the 4 heavy plastic bins of albums and sort through them to find the best pictures. I started the project on a Thursday evening. Most of the albums were from the 80s and 90s, holding that distinct smell of old paper and dusty plastic. I spent hours carefully pulling photos out of the sticky magnetic pages and moving the best ones into a new binder. By 10 p.m., the house was completely silent. I lived alone, and my neighborhood always shut down completely after dark. There was rarely any traffic on my street. Around 10:30, I opened a large, faded green album. Towards the middle of the book, I found a photograph tucked into a plastic sleeve that didn't match the rest of the pages. The surrounding photos were faded Polaroids, but this picture was printed on modern, glossy paper. The colors were incredibly sharp. I pulled it out and held it under the light of the dining room chandelier. It was a picture of me. I was standing in my own backyard, near the edge of the concrete patio, holding a black trash bag. I stared at the image, trying to process what I was looking at. The jacket I was wearing in the photo was a heavy winter coat I had purchased just 3 weeks prior. There was absolutely no way this picture belonged in an album from 20 years ago. My backyard is completely enclosed by a tall wooden privacy fence. Looking closely at the angle of the shot, I could tell the picture had been taken from just inside my wooden side gate, looking toward the patio. I sat in the quiet dining room holding the paper. I reasoned that maybe my older brother had stopped by unannounced one evening while I was taking out the trash. Maybe he took a candid picture as a joke, had it printed, and slipped it into the box when he dropped the bins off at my house. It was a massive stretch, and my stomach dropped slightly, but I didn't want to overreact. I placed the photo face down on the table and went to bed. Friday was uneventful. I worked from home, made sure my doors were locked, and tried to ignore the strange picture. By Saturday evening, I knew I had to finish the sorting. It was raining heavily outside, casting a dull gray light through the front windows. I heard the steady sound of rain hitting the roof. I sat back down at the dining table and pulled the green album toward me. I had left off roughly halfway through the book. I turned the page, and my hand stopped. There was a new photo in the top right sleeve of the left page. I knew for an absolute fact that this specific sleeve had been empty on Thursday night. I had removed a badly water-damaged photo from that exact spot and thrown it in the trash. Now, a fresh, glossy photograph was sitting in its place. I slid the picture out of the plastic. My fingers felt unsteady. It was another picture of me. This time, the setting was inside my house. I was asleep on my living couch. I was wearing the exact same clothes I had worn on Friday evening while watching television. I could even see the television remote resting on my chest in the picture. The room in the photo was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the television screen. The angle of the shot was taken from the main hallway, looking directly out into the living room. Something felt completely off. I lived entirely alone. I didn't have roommates, and I hadn't had a single guest over since the funeral. I stood up from the table and walked over to the hallway. I positioned my feet exactly where the camera would have been. From that spot, standing in the dark corridor, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the couch. I pulled out my phone and called my brother. I asked if he had been over to my house. He sounded genuinely confused and told me he was still 2 states away dealing with estate attorneys. I hung up the phone and walked through my entire house. I checked the heavy wooden front door. The deadbolt was engaged. I walked to the kitchen and checked the back door leading to the garage. It was locked tightly. I went from room to room, checking every single window on the ground floor. They were all latched shut from the inside. There were no broken screens or signs of forced entry. The house was sealed tight. I spent all of Sunday completely on edge. I kept all the blinds drawn shut and made sure the deadbolts were thrown even during the day. I avoided the dining room table entirely. I didn't want to touch the green album, but the memorial gathering was scheduled for Wednesday, and my family needed the completed binders by Tuesday afternoon. I tried to focus on work, but I kept checking the hallway. On Monday night, I decided I just needed to power through and finish the remaining boxes. It was a little past midnight. The rain had stopped, leaving the neighborhood in total silence. I sat down at the dining room table. The green album was resting exactly where I had left it on Saturday. I reached out and opened the heavy cardboard cover. Stuck between the inside cover and the first page was another photograph. It wasn't slid into a plastic sleeve. It was simply resting there, loose on the paper. I picked it up. The edges of the glossy photo paper were still slightly curled, as if it had just been printed a few minutes ago. It was a picture of the dining room. The room was completely dark, illuminated only by the harsh, bright glare of a camera flash. In the center of the photo, I was sitting at the wooden table, looking down at the green album. I was wearing the gray sweater and dark jeans that I currently had on. The picture had been taken from directly behind my chair. I stared at the image. The camera angle was pointed slightly downward. In the photograph, just over my right shoulder, there was a reflection visible in the glass of the sliding patio door located across the room. The flash heavily distorted the glass, but I could clearly make out the shape of a person standing directly behind me. It was a dark silhouette wearing what looked like a heavy hooded sweatshirt. They were holding a small rectangular object up to their face. I didn't turn around. I didn't make a sound. I carefully placed the photo back down onto the table. I stood up from my chair slowly, keeping my eyes fixed straight ahead on the front door. I walked at a steady pace down the short entry hall. I unlocked the deadbolt, stepped out into the cold night air, and pulled the heavy door shut behind me. I walked quickly down the driveway to my car. I got inside and locked the doors before I put the key in the ignition. I drove down the street, pulled into the empty parking lot of a gas station, and dialed the police. 2 officers met me back at my house 20 minutes later. I waited in my car while they went inside. They searched the entire interior, checked the closets, and swept the backyard. They found absolutely no one. However, one of the officers came out and noted that the sliding glass patio door in the dining room was completely unlocked. It made no sense, because I had physically checked that exact lock the day before. While the officers were still there, I packed a duffel bag with enough clothes for the week. I grabbed the green album to show them the photographs, but they couldn't pull any usable fingerprints off the paper. I left that night and checked into a motel near the highway. I never spent another night in that rental house. I broke my lease later that month and hired a moving company to pack up all my furniture while I waited outside in my car. I currently live in a 3rd-floor apartment in a completely different city. I still have the green photo album. I didn't end up giving it back to my family for the memorial. I keep it in a locked drawer in my home office. I haven't opened it in months, but yesterday, I noticed something when I moved it to reach some paperwork. The old binding was stretched slightly wider, as if another empty photo sleeve had recently been filled. Have you ever found something inside your home that proved you weren't alone? It was around the middle of October when I first started noticing something was off, and it only got worse from there. My name is Trevor Langdon. At the time this happened, I was 20 years old, taking a semester off from college and living back home with my parents and my younger sister. We lived in a large, older 2-story house in a quiet, heavily wooded suburb of Columbus, Ohio. The house had a very specific layout. When you walked through the front door, there was a remarkably long central hallway that ran down the entire length of the first floor, connecting the living room, the kitchen, and the stairs leading up to the bedrooms. For as long as I can remember, my mom used the entire left wall of that hallway as a massive family photo collage. There were easily over 100 framed pictures hanging there. They ranged from tiny wallet-sized school photos in cheap plastic squares to large, heavy wooden frames holding professional family portraits. They were all fitted closely together, covering almost every inch of the drywall like a giant, complicated puzzle. The first time something changed, it was subtle. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was walking down the hall to get coffee. I noticed a small gap in the puzzle. A square frame containing a picture of my sister at her middle school graduation had been swapped with an oval frame, holding an old picture of my grandparents. Because the frames were different shapes, they didn't fit right in their new spots, leaving uneven patches of blank wall exposed. It felt strange, but I didn't immediately jump to any worst-case scenarios. I brought it up to my mom later that evening while she was making dinner. She assumed my sister had accidentally bumped into the wall with her heavy school backpack, knocked them down, and just quickly hung them back up in a panic. My sister completely denied doing it. We all brushed it off as typical family miscommunication and didn't think about it again. A few days later, it happened again. I had been up late in my room working on my laptop. Around 2:30 in the morning, I went downstairs to grab a glass of water. The house was completely silent, save for the low humming of the kitchen refrigerator. As I walked down the long hallway, I looked to my left and noticed 3 different frames were out of place. A picture of me from high school, a picture of my dad fishing, and a photo of our old family dog had been moved. Originally, they were hung near the very end of the hallway by the front door. Now, they were grouped together directly in the center of the wall, perfectly at eye level. I turned on the hallway overhead light to get a better look. The frames were hanging crookedly, and I could clearly see faint, dark scuff marks on the off-white drywall where the frames used to be. There were also exposed nail holes where someone had completely pulled the original hardware out of the wall. The next morning, my dad was genuinely annoyed. He told everyone at the breakfast table to stop messing with the pictures because the constant pulling was going to strip the drywall. Once again, both my sister and my mom swore they hadn't touched them. I knew for a fact I hadn't either. The mood in the house shifted from slightly annoyed to uncomfortable. My stomach dropped a bit, because the realization that no one in the family was taking responsibility meant something else was happening. Over the next week, the changes accelerated. The swaps started happening every couple of nights, and they were no longer random. Whoever was moving the frames was organizing them with a specific, deliberate purpose. One morning, all the photos from a family trip to Florida in 2015 were clustered tightly around the hallway thermostat. A few days later, pictures that featured only my mom's side of the family were meticulously lined up in a straight row right above the floorboards. My mom started to think it was an elaborate, mean-spirited prank being pulled by one of my friends. I started paying much closer attention to the hallway itself, looking for any sign of who was doing it. The following Friday morning, after another major rearrangement of the wall, I found physical evidence. Right beneath a newly formed cluster of photos near the kitchen entrance, there was a small clump of dried mud sitting on the hardwood floor. It was roughly the size of a coin, but it was clearly stamped with the rigid tread pattern of a heavy boot. We have a very strict no-shoes policy inside our house. All of our footwear is kept on a rack in the garage. Staring at that piece of dried mud inside our hallway made me feel incredibly uneasy. Someone from outside was coming in. That Saturday afternoon, my parents and my sister went out to run errands and see a movie. I stayed behind, deciding I needed to inspect the wall myself. I waited until their car pulled out of the driveway. Then I walked up to the newest group of moved frames. I started lifting them off their nails, one by one. I checked the wooden edges, the hanging wires, and the cardboard backings, looking for anything out of the ordinary. I pulled down a large, rectangular frame that held a group picture of our extended family at a summer barbecue. As I turned it over in my hands, I noticed a small piece of folded, yellow-lined paper wedged tightly between the thick cardboard backing and the wooden frame. I pulled the paper out and slowly unfolded it. It was a handwritten list. The ink was thick and black, and the handwriting was jagged, messy, and entirely unfamiliar. It wasn't anyone in my family's handwriting. I read down the page. The list contained exact, detailed descriptions of our photo frames, followed by step-by-step instructions on where they were supposed to be moved. The first 3 bullet points perfectly matched the exact rearrangements that had happened over the past 2 weeks. It literally said, "Move Florida trip frames to thermostat." Below that, it read, "Line up mother's relatives by floorboards." Seeing the patterns written down like that made my chest feel incredibly tight. This wasn't a random prank. Someone was planning this out meticulously. The 4th item on the list was dated for that coming Sunday. It read, "Move Trevor's upstairs bedroom photos down to the basement door." I stopped reading and stared at the paper. The pictures of me were currently hanging in a small cluster on the 2nd floor, directly outside my bedroom door. The person writing this list wasn't just walking around our downstairs hallway. They were planning to navigate the entire house, coming upstairs while we slept. I immediately picked up my phone and called my parents, telling them to come home right away. When they arrived and I showed my dad the yellow note, he didn't say a word. He just walked over to the front door, locked the deadbolt, and dialed the police. 2 officers arrived at our house about 20 minutes later. They took the yellow paper to submit as evidence and began a thorough sweep of the property. I walked with one of the officers as they checked the exterior perimeter of the house. In the backyard, tucked behind a thick row of overgrown azalea bushes, they found a small utility window that led down into our unfinished basement. The metal latch on the inside was completely snapped off. The window was pushed open just a fraction of an inch. When the officer shined his flashlight down onto the concrete foundation wall below the window, we could clearly see several thick, muddy boot prints leading down into the dark basement. Someone had been slipping through that window at night, waiting in our basement for the house to get completely quiet, and then creeping upstairs into our main living area just to rearrange the photographs on the wall. They had been inside our house, walking freely while we slept, for over 2 weeks. My dad drove to a hardware store that same evening. He bought heavy-duty screws and permanently sealed every single basement window shut from the inside. We had a comprehensive security system installed the very next day, complete with motion sensors and cameras pointing at every entrance. The police increased their night patrols in our neighborhood for over a month, but they never found anyone matching a description, and no one was ever caught on our new cameras. My mom couldn't bear to look at the hallway wall anymore. She took every single frame down, packed them into heavy plastic storage bins, and put them up in the attic. We patched the hundreds of exposed nail holes and painted the entire hallway a completely different color. It's been about 4 months since we found that yellow note. The house feels completely different now, and the security system gives us some peace of mind. But there's one detail that still bothers me every time I walk down that empty hallway. The police had allowed me to take a picture of the yellow note before they bagged it for evidence. I still look at that picture on my phone sometimes. The 5th and final item on the list wasn't an instruction to move a picture to a different spot on the wall. It was just 3 short words. It simply read, "Take parents' wedding." When my mom took all the frames down to pack them away, she did a thorough inventory of the boxes. Out of over 100 pictures, my parents' silver wedding anniversary frame is the only one missing from the house. Have you ever found a strange object hidden in your house that didn't belong to your family? I was working late one night at my dining room table, sorting through our wedding photos, and everything felt completely normal, until I noticed something that didn't make sense. My name is Jacob Eastwood. Last October, my wife Sarah and I got married. We held our wedding reception at a large rustic event lodge situated in a heavily wooded area just outside of Bend, Oregon. The venue was a massive building with high timber ceilings, a long wooden bar, and a wraparound exterior deck. To keep things fun and capture different angles of the night, we decided to buy 15 cheap, bright yellow disposable cameras. We placed one in the center of every guest table with a little note asking people to take pictures throughout the evening. By the time we got back from our honeymoon, packed up our old apartment and moved into the small, single-story house we had just purchased in a quiet Portland suburb, it was already late January. The box of disposable cameras had been sitting in the trunk of my car for months. I finally took them to a local pharmacy with a photo lab, dropped them off in a large plastic bag, and picked up the developed prints a few days later. I decided to spend a Friday evening building a massive memory board for our living room wall. Sarah had gone to bed early, leaving me alone at the dining room table. Outside, it was raining heavily. I could hear the steady sound of water running through the aluminum gutters. I dumped the heavy pharmacy bag onto the table. It was filled with thick paper envelopes, each containing a stack of glossy prints and the plastic sleeves of film negatives. I started opening the envelopes one by one, separating the bad, blurry pictures from the good ones. The cameras were cheap, so most of the pictures had a harsh, bright flash that washed out the foreground and left the background looking completely black. I opened the envelope labeled for Table 6. This table had been seated near the heavy wooden double doors that led into the venue's kitchen. I flipped through a few photos of my college friends holding up their drinks. On the 4th picture, my hand stopped. The flash had illuminated the faces of my friends sitting at the table. but the light had also caught a figure standing in the background, right next to the kitchen doors. It was a man. He was wearing a very plain, poorly fitted dark suit. Because he was standing at the edge of the camera's flash range, his features were slightly out of focus. His hair was slicked back and his hands were resting rigidly at his sides. He wasn't talking to the waitstaff, and he wasn't looking at my friends. He was just standing against the wooden wall, looking straight ahead. I didn't recognize him at all. We had a relatively small wedding, and I knew exactly who we had invited. I stared at the photo for a minute, feeling a slight bit of confusion, but I didn't overthink it. I figured he was probably a +1 I hadn't formally met, or maybe an off-duty member of the catering staff taking a break in the main hall. I set the picture aside and kept sorting. About 20 minutes later, I opened the envelope for table 11. This table had been placed on the complete opposite side of the large hall, positioned right next to the massive glass windows that looked out onto the dark exterior deck. I pulled out a wide shot of the room. A guest had stood up and taken a picture pointing across the tables toward the windows. The flash reflected brightly off the glass, but just beyond the glare, standing outside on the wooden deck in the cold night air, was the same man. He was wearing the same dark suit. His hands were still rigid at his sides. He was standing close to the glass, looking inward at the reception. Something felt off. I placed the picture from table 6 right next to the picture from table 11. I looked closely at the events happening in both photos. In the first picture by the kitchen, I could see one of the waiters walking past with a tray of champagne flutes. In the second picture from across the room, I could see that same waiter, holding the same tray, standing near the edge of the dance floor. Based on where the waiter was in both shots, these two pictures had to have been taken roughly 60 seconds apart. I felt uneasy. To get from the interior kitchen doors to the exterior deck in under a minute, the man in the dark suit would have had to sprint straight across the crowded dance floor. Either that, or he would have had to exit the kitchen, run all the way around the outside of the massive lodge in the dark, and position himself by the windows. It made absolutely no sense. I abandoned my sorting system and started actively searching the rest of the piles for the dark suit. I went through over 200 photos, scanning the dark backgrounds and the edges of the frames. I found him again in the envelope for table 3. This picture was taken outside on the gravel patio where people were smoking. The man was standing far back near the edge of the thick pine trees, just outside the radius of the patio lights. He wasn't holding a drink, he was just watching the crowd. I found him in another photo from table 9, taken near the coat rack, then another from table 14, standing near the exit hallway. He never interacted with a single guest. He was always positioned on the perimeter of the room, and he was always staring silently into the crowd. The final envelope I opened belonged to the camera we had left on our own sweetheart table. Sarah and I had placed it there so we could take pictures of the guests from our perspective. I pulled the photos out and laid them flat on the dining room table. About halfway through the stack, I found a picture that I definitely didn't take. Someone had picked up the camera from our table while we were seated. The picture was taken from directly behind us. In the bottom corners of the frame, I could clearly see the backs of our wooden chairs and the back of my own head. The camera was pointed straight out toward the center of the room. The dance floor was completely empty, meaning this was taken late in the evening after most people had gone back to their tables. Standing directly in the center of the hardwood floor, maybe 15 feet away from where we were sitting, was the man. The bright flash hit him squarely. His face was slightly angled downward, casting heavy shadows over his eyes, but he was staring directly at the back of our heads. My stomach dropped. Someone had walked right up behind us, stood over our shoulders, and taken a picture of this man standing on the empty floor. Neither Sarah nor I had noticed anyone standing that close to our table. I needed to see his face clearly. The glossy paper prints from the cheap disposable cameras were too grainy to make out any distinct facial features. I walked into my home office, grabbed my high-resolution film scanner, and brought it out to the dining room table. I plugged it into my laptop and started going through the large pharmacy bag, looking for the specific strips of plastic film negatives that corresponded to the strange photos. I dumped the remaining contents of the bag onto the table. Several thin, branded pharmacy sleeves slid out. Mixed in with them, sitting at the very bottom of the pile, was a plain, unmarked brown paper envelope. It was completely different from the packaging the photo lab used. It didn't have a plastic window or a barcode. I opened the unsealed flap and pulled out the contents. Inside was a single long strip of 35mm film negatives. They were wider and thicker than the film used in our disposable cameras. I turned the scanner on. I fed the heavy strip of film into the mechanical slot. I heard the soft whir of the motor as it slowly pulled the plastic through the machine. I sat back and watched my laptop screen, waiting for the scanning software to render the images. A progress bar moved across the screen, and then a grid of 6 thumbnail images appeared. They weren't in color. They were high quality, professional-grade black and white photographs. I clicked on the first image to enlarge it. It was a picture of the lodge from the outside. The camera was positioned far back in the dark tree line, pointing through the pine branches toward the brightly lit windows of the reception hall. In the center of the frame, visible through the glass, were Sarah and I having our first dance. I clicked on the next image. It was taken from a different angle in the woods, closer to the building. It showed Sarah sitting at the sweetheart table, laughing with a guest. The third and fourth images were more of the same. Someone had been standing in the freezing woods, using a professional camera to take black and white photos of us through the windows. I felt completely sick. I moved my mouse over to the 5th image on the strip and clicked to enlarge it. It wasn't a picture of the wedding. It wasn't a picture of the lodge or the woods. It was a picture of a house. I stared at the black and white image on my screen. I recognized the sloping roof. I recognized the shape of the front porch and the small concrete walkway leading up to the door. I recognized the large oak tree sitting in the front yard. It was the house I was currently sitting inside. The house we had just moved into. My hands felt entirely numb. I slowly reached across the dining room table and picked up the plain brown envelope the negatives had come in. I turned it over in my hands, looking for any kind of identifying mark. In the top right corner, there was a faded red ink stamp from a post office. The date on the stamp was October 14th. That was 2 days after our wedding. Written in thick black pen directly across the center of the envelope, beneath the date stamp, was a single line of text. It wasn't a name. It was the exact street address of our new house. We didn't even start looking at real estate listings until late November. I have absolutely no idea how that envelope ended up in our bag from the pharmacy, and I still don't know who placed it there. Have you ever found a photograph that shouldn't exist?